Our next speaker excuse me, is Professor John Fitzgerald, known to many, and I'm sure. John is an economic broadcaster and writer and is well known for his very clear and penetrating economic analysis. He had a distinguished career in ESRI, but he now serves as chair of the Climate Change Advisory Council. And climate change and biodiversity are so interwoven. I really am looking forward to what he has to say to us this morning. John.
Thank you very much, Kieran. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. I'm afraid I'm not going to sing or tweet. I'm here just as an economist to set some of the background against which we are working to preserve and develop biodiversity. Almost 20 years ago, the UK House of Lords Committee was in Dublin looking at the environment, and I was asked to go, and I was sitting beside the environment spokesman for one of the major political parties, and the chairman said he wanted to talk first about biodiversity, and that spokesman whispered to me, "Will you go first? I know nothing about biodiversity." I think this conference is a tribute to where we've come in the last 20 years and the fact that Minister Madigan was here to open it. And I hope that in the next election, unlike the last election, that all party manifestos have something to say on the environment, on climate change and biodiversity. Quite a number. They didn't all in the last one. In terms of the next 30 years or so, the background against which we are going to have to conserve and develop the environment is going to be one with a rising population, unlike much of the rest of Europe. And that footprint, how we manage that footprint, is going to be hugely important. The population will rise by probably a third, possibly more. Also, the average age of that population will rise by 5 or 6 years. At the moment, the average age is about 37 now. I'm about twice that, or almost twice that, but it's going to rise significantly. The proportion of people under 20 today is almost 30%. It's going to be down to 20% by 2050. And the proportion of old fogies like myself will rise from about an eighth to a quarter of the population. All of this will have a wider impact on society. And one which I think we tend to underestimate is education. That 1/8 of my cohort had the opportunity to go to get third level education. It's now over half. And that changes our behaviour. It changes our earning power. And it also changes where we live. The kind of work that people with third level education seek is generally only found in cities. And one of the complications is that, like the Noah's Ark, we come as animals 2 by 2. And to find 2 jobs for 2 graduates tends to be in cities. So we're looking at an Ireland which will be more urban in terms of its employment by 2050. But research done 10 years ago by a colleague of mine, Edgar Morganroth, looking at 1995 to 2005, the jobs were appearing in cities. But people in Ireland wanted to live in rural areas. And the model that happened was unsustainable, where people wanted to commute long distances into cities. He showed that if you continued that model, the country would grind to a halt. Apart from any environmental effects, it just would not work. So one of the important contexts for policy is the National Planning Framework, which envisages growth of Cork by Galway, Waterford by a very significant amount, and also significant growth in Dublin. But we have to develop in the future a much denser form of development, or we will grind to a halt. So that's one of the backgrounds in terms of what's likely to happen. Also brings a changed lifestyle. People work in offices, not in fields, not outside. How they entertain themselves is different. In that, when I was a child, my father, I was fortunate, he took me around the country, and you'd climb mountains and do various things, and you'd never meet anybody. The way an educated, wealthy population entertains itself will use the countryside in a very different way, and managing that in a way that doesn't damage, that is consistent with biodiversity, is going to be an increasing challenge. The tourism in the 1950s, when I was a child, you might go to Bettystown, 20 miles, 30 miles north of where we lived, to the sea. Now people fly in and fly out, and managing a world of mass tourism is going to have an impact on the environment. And that impact is, and that issue is going to become bigger as time moves on. The democratization of transport, where when I was a child, to begin off with, we didn't have a car, and then we were lucky we did have a car. In the future, everybody will have personal mobility, or the vast bulk of the population, which means that while we may live in cities, it will have a much wider impact on the environment. Now, I'm chair of the Climate Change Advisory Council, and our job is to recommend how we can decarbonise Ireland by 2050 at a least cost way. And I think in terms of managing climate change, managing biodiversity, what is important is to recognise we are one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And if the only way of decarbonising, or the only way of protecting and developing biodiversity, was to return to the standards of living in the 19th century, it just wouldn't happen. We have to find a way that is consistent with the kind of society that we want, and which does meet our objectives in climate change, which does meet our objective in biodiversity, and that's one of the things that this conference is addressing. In terms of climate change, there are things we need to shut down peat of our generation immediately. Unfortunately, it's going to take another decade. That potentially has significant benefits for biodiversity as well as for climate change. There are quite a number of the changes that we need for climate change, which will also have benefits, spin-off benefits elsewhere. There may be others where there are conflicts. We need to deploy much more renewable electricity. That may mean more wires. It may mean placing solar cells on fields or whatever. That there may be conflicts as well, which will have to be managed. One of the important areas where we need to change will be agriculture. By 2050, we need to have fewer animals on the land, very possibly more dairy cows, and that's a very profitable activity for farmers. Farmers actually make nothing net out of beef cattle. We need to probably reduce cattle numbers, and that will involve changing land use. That some of the land that is currently in pasture should be developed in terms of forestry or in terms of growing biomass, and that has implications in how we manage it. This is not going to work for farming unless farmers are better off as a result of the change. And that's something which Kieran mentioned at the beginning, that it is getting buy-in, it is how we do this in a way that is consistent with the standard of living that we all seek, and meets our objectives in terms of decarbonising Ireland and protecting biodiversity. That is the challenge we face over the next 30 years. It is not always going to be consistent, as I said, that there will be differences, there will be conflicts, and how we manage them will be important. But if we are to succeed, and this is something that the previous speaker have talked about, we need to get buy-in from everybody, and that is what the emphasis of this conference is about. This is something where I think through compromise we can move forward, but those compromises must reflect the changes that are occurring in society. And for me, I'd be here to see some of them, but not all of them. Most of you will live to see 2050, and it is how we make the changes in society which protect the environment in all its forms. Thank you.